Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Aggramar on Mythic in Antorus, the Burning Throne.
So this fight is definitely the most difficult up to this point, arguably the most difficult in the instance. However, the encounter's theme has not changed from Heroic, as the difficulty still lies with the adds that spawn in both intermissions. This is intensified on Mythic because many more adds spawn, but also some already have half energy. The three phases have also changed, but in very small ways, and actually play out similar to how you've done them on Heroic. Now, before we go into details about the changes and go through the guide phase by phase, we should talk about composition first, as it's extremely important for this encounter.
To start off, you'll definitely want Death Knights. The more you have, the easier the adds become. Blood Death Knights being best, as mass grips on top of single grips are super powerful for ad management. We had 1 DPS and 2 Blood Death Knights on our original kill, but it is possible to kill the boss without any Death Knights at all. But good luck. It's definitely going to increase your time progressing this boss if you don't have any Death Knights at all. If you do not have the option for bringing Blood Death Knights, then simply 2-tank the fight. However, if you can bring them, you'll want to 3 or even 4-tank the encounter. The idea is that the DKs don't necessarily physically tank the boss, and instead they focus on dealing with the adds. We'll go over exact grip strategies later in the video. For a first kill, we would recommend 5 healing. The HPS requirement after phase 1 until the boss dies is pretty high, and 5 healers makes this far more comfortable. Having 5 healers also allows you to use additional cooldowns at points where multiple adds explode at the same time. Keep in mind when choosing your healers that the majority of the damage is the dot on the raid, so stacking raid healers may be more effective than, say, stacking paladins. Last to mention is your DPS. Would recommend that you bring knockback classes. For us, this is typically 2 boomkins with maybe a resto druid and a disc as a backup. Using things like Typhoon, Thundershock, and a disc knockback on a rotation helps keep the adds under control. Slows are also important, so maybe having something like a Hunter with their tar traps, or having one of your Blood Death Knights keep their Death and Decay on those adds also helps keep them under control. On top of this, you'd also want to bring at least 1 Shadow Priest. At set points, adds will become enraged and must be dispelled, and Mass Dispel is the most effective for this job. Your Healing Priest could also do this job, but a large portion of their very valuable mana will be used in the process. So stick to at least 1 Shadow Priest just to make sure that these adds are always dispelled. Also to mention, it is worth having a Warlock with the slow corruption ring. That player single-handedly is responsible for most of the CC on the adds during the intermission. Other players can be assigned to the job, but a Warlock pretty much just takes everyone's job and just consolidates it into one person. Now throughout the fight, the boss will apply debuffs to ranged players. The debuff itself we'll touch on in a moment, but what's important to know is that you'll need at least 10 viable ranged targets. Otherwise, this debuff will be placed on melee every other time they come out instead. It is manageable, but yeah, it's not ideal on melee whatsoever. So stick to 10 players that are considered ranged targets and you'll be good. Last to mention is the Taste-Shellac technique. The order in which the boss will cast his abilities will be different every time. He will still cast 2 Foe Breakers, 2 Flame Rends, and a single Searing Tempest, but the order in which they come in is slightly randomized. All you need to know is that he will never cast Flame Rend back to back, and the sequence will never start with a Searing Tempest. On Mythic, the Flame Rend hit part of the Taste-Shellac technique also applies a debuff that increases the damage you take from the next Flame Rend by 500% for 30 seconds. This forces you to have different people take the hit each time, with a minimum of 6 players each time, or the boss will gain a permanent 50% damage increase for each player missing. With only a single damage increase buff on the boss, you're almost certainly going to wipe, so it's vital that you have at least 6 players take the hit each and every time. Now there are 2 different ways of dealing with this. 1, you can simply organize 2 subgroups within your raid for each Flame Rend hit, 10 people for the first and 10 people for the second. 2, which is a DPS increase and far less damage to heal, use a minimum of 6 players every time, primarily using rogues to cheese. This works because the Flame Rend debuff can be immune using Cloak of Shadows, and no other form of immunity works. So if you do happen to have 4 rogues, they can cloak the first hit and feign the second hit. You only need to have 2 other players within the Flame Rend to prevent the boss gaining the damage increase. This can be done by your tanks if you're 3 or 4 tanking. If you're only 2 tanking, then instead, have a single tank and rotate in DPS players using large damage reductions, such as Warlocks or Druids with Bear Form. The Rogue Cloak, however, will not be up for every sequence, you'll have it for every other. On the sequence where it isn't available, we have Rogues plus 2 players take the first hit using Feint, and then they dodge the second hit completely. The entire raid then takes the second hit to compensate. By the time the third sequence comes in, the Rogues are ready to take all 2 Flame Rend hits again.
Now the chances that you have 4 rogues at your disposal definitely isn't going to be likely. We feel, however, it is worth using this strategy, even if you have, say, 2 of them, To make up for the lack of the rogues, you'll simply just need to organise individual players to move into the individual flame rends and just use large damage reductions. As already mentioned, Warlocks and Druid are pretty good for this, but almost any class can do it. Demon Hunters are great for it. They can actually do the rogue's job by taking both hits. They can use Blur on the first and Never Walk on the second. However, the only issue with Demon Hunters is that by the time the second technique comes around, there is a possibility that Blur is not back off cooldown based on what spell order the boss decided to do during the first technique. So if the boss did Flame Rend 4th in the first technique, and then does it first on the second technique, the Demon Hunter will definitely die because Blur won't be ready. This, however, doesn't prevent you from assigning a Demon Hunter for one whole technique at some point throughout the encounter, or even just used as a backup. Shamans can be part of it by using Astral Shift, Holy Paladins can be part of it using Divine Protection and Judgment, Priests can use Shield and Disperse, you get the picture. Just keep in mind when you're organising your Flame Ring groups, you want to put 6 players in each time, and without any damage reduction, each player is going to get hit for around 8 million or so fire damage on each person. So you need to make sure you actually assign players that can survive it. You could use other immunity classes if you really wanted to. Just keep in mind that only Cloak immunes the debuff application, and therefore you're not really gaining anything but the damage reduction, which really should be saved at later points of the fight where you're panicking or you've messed up. And if none of this works for you whatsoever, then you're simply just going to have to assign more than 6 players each time. It's not ideal whatsoever, especially in Phase 3 where raid damage is at its highest, but that's the only other solution. And with all that out of the way, let's go through the fight phase by phase and see exactly what you need to do.
So jumping into phase 1, this phase is the exact same on Heroic in terms of abilities, except Scorching Blaze has been completely removed from the encounter and has been replaced by Ravenous Blaze. This is a debuff applied to 5 random ranged players, and this is the debuff that I mentioned earlier that you need 10 ranged players for, otherwise it's going to start going on melee players also. It deals moderate damage to the player, but it also has a targeting circle that increases in size over its duration. Any other player within this targeting circle will very likely just be one-shot. So to counter the debuff, the raid is pre-spread in a large semicircle around the room. That way very little movement is required when the debuffs are applied, and no one should be within range of one another's circle. Aside from that, phase 1 is very simple, just nuke the boss and you should only ever see a single sequence and you'll transition into the first intermission. So there is a lot to talk about here as so much happens in a very short period of time. Let's get the basics out of the way first. There are 10 embers and 2 flames. Just like Heroic, you kill the 2 flames and you'll transition into the next phase. Some of the embers now also start with half energy instead of 0, as shown clearly by this weak aura that displays the energy percentage above their head. Now not only is there more embers, but they also gain energy slightly faster than they did on Heroic, exploding after 165 seconds rather than 180. As a result, you're forced to explode 2 at a time at least once per set, and we do this as we transition out of the phase. Because there are more embers, it is also difficult for tanks to find a spot where they can keep the flames without enraging the embers. The moment the phase begins, both flame adds are moved towards the edges immediately. On the way, they are moved through embers. This does enrage those embers, however it quickly drops providing that the flame adds are moved fast. Once the enrage drops on the embers, we land stuns on them to compensate for the distance they covered. All DPS immediately swap to the flame adds and begin to kill them off. DPS should save cooldowns for this phase just to make it as quick as possible. Now for the rest of the embers, at the start of the phase we have 1 DK grip, a 50 energy add towards the boss and let it walk in. That puts you down to 9 adds right from the start. Meanwhile, a single Warlock goes around the entire room and slows every single ember with Corruption using the Corruption legendary ring. The idea is that the flame adds die and the boss transitions before the ember adds reach the middle of the room. We also have another DK grip 1 ember add on top of another, and both adds are stunned. These are the adds that we double explode on as the boss transitions and walks away from the middle of the room. This will put you down to 7 adds to deal with in phase 2. Any adds that get close to the boss are stunned, or you can use hard CC, but do note that hard CC on this fight on Mythic doesn't work for very long. It's normally around 7 seconds for whatever you use, so don't use that as a permanent solution, just use it if you're getting into a bit of trouble and need to stop an ad from getting too close to the boss. But ideally, if you're fast with just killing the flame adds, this shouldn't be needed at all. In terms of healing cooldowns during this phase, we use a single large output CD with disc CDs.
Now as soon as the flame adds die, the raid stacks in a single location and the boss is taunted over the top of the 2 adds. At this point we use another set of healing CDs, which is usually a large output CD with either a link or a barrier. Melee are pre-hotted at this point as they're not going to be within raid cooldowns. The remaining adds are then mass scripted into a single clump, most importantly away from the raid, and they are then AoE'd down. A high energy ad within the clump is single gripped out to the side before they are AoE down. It's important this guy doesn't die because you're going to use him next once the 2-stack has dropped. The reason why they're mass gripped away from the raid is because of Flare. Flare on Mythic is the exact same as Heroic, except it will revive and enrage any ads within it. This enrage increases their movement speed and makes them CC immune. You can dispel this effect, but doing so deals a small burst of damage to the raid per ad. We have all 3 flares right at the start spawn in the exact same location, and then the raid just spreads back into their phase 1 positions, but people still need to keep in mind that flares are going to keep spawning throughout the encounter, but providing you're not stood on top of embers, you'll be absolutely fine. From this point onwards, you'll just want to constantly CC the ad, primarily by slows and knockbacks, and grip the ads into the boss one by one, prioritizing the ones with the most energy. Having a single person in your raid track knockback CDs and call out the knockback rotation is a really good idea. It prevents any players overlapping their knockbacks and potentially ruining any ember positions. Mass grips typically shouldn't be included in this rotation during this phase unless it's absolutely needed to restack the ads because perhaps knockbacks have been done poorly. If you do decide to use mass grips, they're definitely best used before a technique. This is because not only Flare will enrage the ads, but Searing Tempest does also. If the entire group of ads gets hit by the Searing Tempest and then you then mass dispel them, the raid becomes chunked with an absolutely massive amount of damage. It's vital that the majority of them, ideally none of them, are ever hit by any of the enrage effects. Note from this point onwards that Searing Tempest also has a gravity drag effect. This is more of a problem to melee rather than anyone else. You just got to make sure that you move out a lot quicker than you normally would. We'd recommend to your Blood Death Knights to use the movement speed legendary boots if they can. It will make their job so much easier. And that's all you need to know for now. You just need to constantly keep knocking back the ads, keep them slowed, and grip them in one by one until they're all gone. Once all the ads are removed from the phase, it completely relaxes, and healers will get some downtime just to get CDs back and mana back ready for the next intermission.
Now this intermission is played out like the first, however instead of gripping a single ad towards the boss at the start, we instead do 2. Additionally, you've got to dodge Wake of Flame lines. Getting hit here without a personal up is extremely dangerous, so it's vital that you avoid them. We use personals and 1 additional healing cooldown to compensate for having 2 stacks at this point. And before the intermission is over, we also grip another ad so they are stacked on top of each other, just like the previous intermission, as we're going to do 2 again as we transition. Going into phase 3, we stack again and use a barrier, link, and a single large output CD as we run the boss over the 2 ads. Again, we mass grip the ads into a clump away from the raid. You'll notice, however, we're stood back further this time. Flares from this point onwards will spawn Wake of Flame lines as well as an ad each. These ads spawn with 0% energy, and as they spawn from flares, they'll also be enraged by them. You want to mass dispel all 3 ads as they spawn. This is where Blood Death Knights really come into their own. Because the flares cannot be spawned near the main pack of ads because of the risk of enraging them, the 3 ads that spawn from those flares become another different set to deal with, essentially halving your CC on the main pack. However, mass grips completely solve this. The best time for you to mass grip is kind of up to you. We find that the best time personally is either right after a flare once the ads are within range to instantly group them all up together, or during a Searing Tempest to make 100% sure there won't be any enraged ads. Just simply whenever the situation comes up that you'll be 100% able to grip all the ads into a single clump. Just note that with 2 Blood Death Knights you will not be able to grip them at the same set point every single time. The first DK grip will have around 20 seconds cooldown or so before you can use it for the 3rd grip. For it to do it at a set point every single time without fail, you'll have to use 3 Blood Death Knights, and that's just getting stupid. The reason we mention this is because you'll have to use something else to stop the ads from being spread or getting close to one another during the 20-second downtime. Vortex is a good option. Knocking the ad packs towards each other rather than directly away from the boss is also a good idea, or ultimately you could consider flat out killing most of the ads. Just keep in mind that you still want to have a high uptime on the raid dot, as having a double explosion in the last phase can be even more lethal than usual. Now as for the rest of the phase, it's the same as phase 2. The boss will start with a flare, then debuffs, and then a sequence. This is repeated until he enrages or he dies. The only other change in this phase is the foe breaker hit on the tank from the technique. This hit will now apply a debuff that stuns you and places a large targeting circle around you. When the stun times out, or hopefully is dispelled, you'll do a burst of damage to all players within the circle. This isn't lethal damage by any means, but considering everything else that's going on, it's really not a good idea to have your entire melee team hit by it. With that in mind, melee need to make sure they move away from the tanks when Foe Breaker is cast, and you'll need to assign healers to instantly dispel it. 1 healer for the first tank, and then another healer for the second. It is vital that dispels are instant, as the tanks still need to react to either the Flame Rend or the Searing Tempest. If they're sat in a stun, then they can't face the boss in the right direction or move from the circle, and as a result, you'll probably wipe the raid. Now, whilst on the topic of healers, cooldowns in this phase are used more or less when they come back up from the intermission, but obviously you want to use them in a staggered way just so they don't overlap. Although if everything is done smoothly, largely they're not even needed. But that's at least how we do this, boss. Of course, there's like a billion ways to do it depending on your composition and how you want to deal with the ads in the intermission. You just got to basically take away that you want to keep a very high uptime on the ad explosion dot on the raid just to make sure you keep on top of everything. And as for phase 3, considering you're using Bloodlust in this phase as well, just to get the boss down as soon as you possibly can, it's super unlikely that you'll actually be exploding any ads from the flares. However, on a first kill, you might need to deal with the first set. So there you are.
So thank you very much for watching, guys. If this guide did help you out, then please do drop us down a like. It helps us out a lot. If you'd like to know more about this encounter, then do go check out our written work over on Wowhead. The link for that can be found in the description. And before we do go, we'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You guys are fantastic. We appreciate all the support you guys give us. If you'd like to know more about that, the link for that can also be found in the description. But that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching again, and we shall see you all in the next video.
Thanks for watching.